Hello, I'm Tom Hartman in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. To add insult to injury to America's job crisis, there's a new crisis brewing: health care. With yearly premiums set to skyrocket to over $30,000. Isn't it time for a radical transformation of our nation's health care system? And later in tonight's Daily Take, I'll explain how we could all wake up one morning in November next year with Scooby-Doo as our president. Ooh. It's Wednesday, the night when I'm the lone liberal and go up against two conservative political commentators to debate the week's biggest stories so far. On our panel tonight, Vince Colanese, homepage editor with thedailycaller.com, and Seton Motley, conservative consultant and founder and president and CEO and chairman of the board of Less Government.
And bottle washer.
Yeah, okay, there you go. All right. It appears we're headed for a health care crisis in America if you don't consider 50 million people being uninsured an existing health care crisis. A new Kaiser survey of employer-based insurance found that premiums have increased 113% since 2001. They're expected to double over the next decade until the average annual premium for a family is over $3,200. It's going to mean employers forcing their workers to foot the bill for their health insurance. So just how much longer are we going to take this stuff?
Well,
go. I think what we're looking at is, Obamacare didn't actually head in the direction of solving the problem you're looking at. I think the Kaiser Health Survey is actually really interesting and actually sort of telling that we have a health care problem that needs to be attacked, and that's that we need to figure out ways in the private market to actually resolve this health care issue. And there's a lot
For example,
go ahead.
I was just going to say an example that has worked in any other developed country.
Well, I'm sure. I mean,
the only one I know of is Switzerland.
I've got the solution. The number one reform that would do it was it was the height of hypocrisy on the part of the Obama administration to somehow insist that they had the authority to mandate health insurance based on the Interstate Commerce Clause, but they won't let you buy across state lines. So if you want true reform, allow purchase across state lines, you'll have a dramatic rush.
That's one of those soundbite things that sounds.
It's not a soundbite. No, it's not a soundbite thing.
Well, let me explain why it's not. Why it is a soundbite. That's one of the. And it's the same thing with credit cards, for example. The law, and thank God, says that individual states can have their insurance commissioners who can make sure that the people in the state don't get screwed. In other words, local control. This is very much a 10th Amendment issue. This is very much a local control issue. And if you were a genuine conservative, you would be gung-ho.
You don't understand the system. You don't understand the system.
Protect the people in their
They mandate all kinds of stupid things in some of the states.
No, that's mandated by health insurance law.
California mandates that every person that buys insurance have transgender surgery coverage. That's absurd.
That's up to California.
But that's fine. So if I live in California, but I want to buy in Iowa, when there's only seven state if I want to buy in Iowa when there's only 7 state mandates,
move to Iowa.
No, you don't have to move. Why do you have to move to buy insurance?
So you don't believe in local control? Okay,
I do believe in local control. I believe in free markets. I believe in free markets.
Look, the idea
nationally, apparently, not statewide.
There's a lot involved here. I mean, obviously, if you can open up the market to a national system, that way people do have the options.
Then you'll have like the credit card thing, where everybody, all the credit card, all the insurance companies.
Organizations, every one of these
banks,
every one of these insurance companies will have to compete against one another for national audiences, and you're going to have to just by nature the prices will have to come down.
Not right now. There's 7 big insurance companies.
Additionally, the third-party payer system is part of the problem. You have an issue where people don't have any skin in the game, and all of a sudden they're going to start feeling it now, obviously, because you're going to have these employers, like you said, that are going to have to pass more and more as they tighten their own belts.
At the end of the day, a real reform would be to not tether health insurance to the employer. That's absurd. That's a World War II dinosaur that needs to go away.
Let's put it all in the government. Let's go to Medicare Part E for everybody.
You mean like Solyndra?
Let's
have the Solyndra health care bill.
The so-called job create, that program that the Bush administration worked on for 2 years.
Then they said don't fund it. And the last memo in the folder they handed the Obama administration said don't fund it.
Right.
It did.
The so-called job creators are hard at work trying to kill jobs. I mean, this Frank Luntz
the Obama administration
thousands of layoffs are planned on Wall Street here. Now we've got Goldman Sachs announcing that they're going to cut $1.2 billion in costs by laying off 1,000 American workers. At the same time, the apologists for these same banksters are saying, oh, we can't raise the taxes on banksters. They pay 15% income tax. Oh, my God, we can't raise their taxes. They won't create any more jobs.
It's capital gains.
Capital gains tax.
Right.
Well, it is actually capital gains is a variation on income tax.
Well, it's a double taxation. They've already paid income tax on the money. It absolutely is. They paid money on the taxes. They paid taxes on the money they made. Then they invest it, and then they get screwed on 15% on that. And what's absurd is they charge 50% on a capital gains win. The maximum you can deduct, the maximum loss you can deduct in any given year is $3,000. It's an absurd scam.
So you're saying that a carpenter who goes to work and uses his hammer, and he's already paid taxes on the money he used to buy that hammer, is being double taxed when he's getting income tax?
That's stupid.
It's the exact same argument. You're saying that people who make money with money should only pay 15% maximum income tax, but if you make money with a hammer, you should pay 36%.
No, I want to lower the 36 rate to 15.
Well, okay. Well, then you would be consistent, but
I mean,
that's what I want.
I mean, what you're trying to go at is the question of people getting laid off in an economy.
Don't destroy the government.
In an economy that's clearly, I mean, tightening its belt across the board. These are banks that are tightening their belts, and how does that happen? I mean, of course they have to tighten their expenses, and sometimes that includes payroll. Everyone's suffering in this economy, and that doesn't just mean. I think what you're trying to do. What you're trying to do is make a distinction.
Vince, last year was the most profitable year for corporate America in the history of this nation.
That's because they got government money.
No, it was
they got government money and they didn't.
Because they laid off all kinds of people and they're sitting on $2 trillion.
Wait. For the money that they're sitting on, and the sitting on argument's interesting. Why do you think any company would sit on money right now? I mean, it's clear that you have government regulation. Government regulation
to sit on money. They'd love to invest it. That's absurd, Tom.
Okay, well, there is no demand in the economy right now.
No,
we're in a depression.
No,
we're on the edge of one.
The government is dropping regulatory anvils all over the place, and they're not going to invest.
Name one.
Name one?
Yeah.
EPA.
The EPA is not a regulatory anvil, it's an agency.
They're dropping regulatory anvils like enforcing cap and trade even though it never got passed. The NLRB is telling Boeing they can't go...
something that never passed.
Well, they're looking for ways to enforce it.
Neutrality was never passed, and the FCC's jamming it down our throats. That's a regulatory anvil that's just been dropped.
And these regulations, if you wonder where regulations come from, you mentioned agencies. Of course, agencies beget regulations. I mean, that's
regulations come from people who are saying, you know, I'd really rather not have my children be poisoned. I'd really rather have the air.
They have to come from the People's Congress. They can't just be jammed through by executive branch regulatory fiat, Tom.
But Tom, if you're
this isn't a dictatorship.
Congress can stop them anytime.
Well, they shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
They can stop them anytime.
They are. The Congressional Review Act.
You've kind of made a sweeping generalization about regulation, though. Are you saying you're in favor of all regulation across the board?
No.
Okay.
And neither am I opposed to all. It's a cliche. It's a cliche. Surely. That's my objection to it. Is that anyhow, cops started a brutal crackdown on Wall Street. Did you guys see the video of this guy putting the pepper spray or the mace right in this woman's eyes? I mean, she was just standing there. They were hurting them, and it turns out that this cop has apparently several civil rights violations in the past. These kinds of things apparently associated with political things, although we're not sure. But the question. Well, in fact, here let's just show our viewers this picture that we're talking about.
She was supposed to be moving, and she wasn't moving.
No, actually, she couldn't. There was
no one around her.
They were herding people into confined areas with those orange things, and then they pepper sprayed one of them. But I don't want to debate the relative merits of that police officer or that case. None of us were there, and it probably should be adjudicated somehow. I'm curious about the larger question. Our military, our police departments all across the country are being hyper-militarized. Are we turning into a police state?
Well, I think I kind of fall on both sides of this issue. I've seen police officers who have stretched their authority far too far. I mean, you see police officers who get behind the badge and they actually feel enabled to do things that they really shouldn't be doing, and that's the type of thing that has to be stopped. In this video, and I think you appropriately said, we don't know the context. This is one of those things where you can see a clip and a lot of people are enraged. There's a lot of passion. You see a lot, obviously, young women who are being pepper sprayed, and the types of emotions that any person should have are, wow, that's pretty shocking. But also, I'd like to know more.
But we had posse comitatus in the 1870s until about 5 years ago. that said that it was illegal for the federal government to turn its guns on its own citizens. I don't understand why the Bush administration repealed that. We have now a nationwide push by police departments to criminalize photographing public officers doing, out there.
You and I agree on that.
We won't be debating this part very long.
Yeah, it just seems okay. In that case, then let's move along.
On that issue.
CDC food safety, listeria. We've got this listeria contamination now. 72 people have been sickened. 13 have been killed. Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Texas. Ron Paul's state. And Ron Paul's the guy who says, there should not be any food safety regulation, along with you, Seton, I know. What's the deal here? Republican Jack Kingston defended the cuts, $87 million from the FDA, $35 million from the USDA, both specifically for food safety. Jack Kingston said, do we believe that McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken and Safeway and Kraft Food and any brand name that you can think of, that these people aren't concerned about food safety? The food safety in America is very safe because the private sector self-polices. And, I would think, by and large, that there's a strong incentive for that. But isn't self-policing, doesn't this prove that waiting until after the harm is done is stupid?
No, because what's stupider is relying on government to execute it properly in advance. As we see time and time again, they had 36 million pounds of poisoned turkey got through. We have to assume that at 36 million pounds, the government got a hold of some of it, looked at it, and said, aye, on the all, pass it on through.
There's about one inspector for about every 7,000 food processing facilities
in America.
Well, yeah, but the point is,
if Kraft puts out a bad product, people aren't going to buy Kraft.
If that company that had that 37 million pounds of turkey was actually doing this free market self-inspection, they would have caught it when it was only a half.
When it comes to food inspection, one of the few things the government, I think, has gotten right, and I think Seton will disagree with me on this point, but gotten right over time, has been this, to an extent, food safety. Now, what you're dealing with here is a question of diminishing returns. A century ago, if you were to look at the numbers of people who were affected by foodborne illnesses, and deaths for that matter, you'd be seeing in the thousands of a certain
But not all of it was from the food. It was from the lack of refrigeration in the home and all those things.
There's a lot of contributing factors. But now you're seeing, obviously, how many have we seen died? You cited some numbers.
17 people.
Right now, that is,
72.
I hate to say this, but the government does attribute a cost to an individual's life. At some point, it's far too expensive to be able to create the types of diminishing returns that actually gets people to very few people killed in something like this. I would say that they need to continue to do their jobs, but I don't think that this calls for any sort of expansion of their work.
And real quick, I just want to say I don't like the term self-policing because it's not the company themselves that are policing them. It's the marketplace. If Kraft keeps putting out bad food, no one's going to buy Kraft, and they're done. It's not them policing themselves. It's 320 million consumers.
In the abstract, that's a great and noble argument, but it's also an argument that is reactive rather than proactive. It's an argument where what you're saying is after 10 or 15 or 20 people are dead, then we'll do.
The last people I want the proactive business is government.
Our quick fire question here. Here it is. A security assessment team with the Department of Energy, basically the same guys who make sure that our nuclear weapons factories are safe, did a test on just how safe our Diebold electronic voting machines are. What they found is someone with just $26 worth of tools and an 8th grade knowledge of science can hack into machines, change the vote results, and leave no trace behind. So, in this age of hacktivism, groups like Anonymous, are we really to believe that they're not going to try something out like this next year? So let's assume they do. Which new president would be brought to us by hackers? And who would you be most satisfied with? A, Charlie Sheen and his platform of legalizing all drugs. B, Donald Trump and his tax credit for when hair plugs go bad. Or C, Yosemite Sam and his gun rights platform.
I think these anonymous people actually revel in the opportunity to throw some random characters. So I'm going to go with, was it the Elmer Fudd at the end? Yosemite Sam. Yeah, I think they like that whole cartoon character thing.
Yes, I'm going to go with Yosemite Sam.
Yosemite Sam. Yosemite Sam would be pretty good. Or maybe Leghorn, Cleghorn. What was
it? Would be a very law and order
Foghorn
administration.
Leghorn, yeah, thank you. Yeah, there you go. Okay, I'll reveal mine during the Daily Take tonight. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Seton, great to see you both. Coming up, bet you didn't know your love for Monday Night Football or beloved courtside seats at your favorite basketball game is fueling the right-wing agenda. After the break, I'll tell you how your team's spirit and dollars go hand in hand with politics.
What drives the world?
The fear-mongering used by politicians.
Who makes decisions?
Considerable breakthrough has already been made.
Who can you trust?
No one who is imbued with a global missionary zeal.
Where are we heading?
State-controlled capitalism is called fascism.
When nobody dares to ask, we do. RT, question more.
Remember the old adage that sports and politics don't mix? Well, the ties go much further than most sports fans can imagine. Professional sports teams' owners are among the wealthiest people in the world. And it turns out that much of the profit these people make off us attending their games is going toward promoting far-right political agendas and pushing that ideology onto unsuspecting fans. And they're doing it without any public scrutiny. So would sports fans be so willing to shell out hundreds of dollars to see their favorite teams on the field if they knew what political enterprises their money is really funding? Dave Zirin, politics and sports editor at The Nation magazine and author of Bad Sports, How Owners Are Ruining the Games We Love, is here to offer some insight on this issue. Dave, welcome back.
Hey, great to be here, Tom.
Great to have you with us. I think most people have no idea what the owners are up to. You want to just give us the overview breakdown?
Sure. I mean, I call it the Kaiser Sose principle. I mean, did you see the movie The Usual Suspects?
I didn't.
Oh, you didn't? Okay. Well, everyone else in America did. Yeah. Well, there's a line where the bad guy says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing us that he didn't exist. Yeah. Owners tend to do their business in shadows, and they've turned sports into a very highly leveraged real estate scam that goes to funding the kinds of political organizations on the far, far right of the American fringe. Call it the Colorado Springs Consortium, groups like Focus on the Family Research Council, groups of that nature. You know, groups that promote reparative therapy for LGBT people, groups that like do the kind of anti-abortion work that puts your teeth on edge, and groups that really go after the kind of basic civil liberties and civil rights that we fought for these last many decades. I mean, and the thing about it that's so troubling is if these guys are rich and that's what they want to fund, fine, great. The problem is that they also take billions of dollars in public subsidies to fund their operations. That's what makes it so noxious.
I remember in 2000, as when Bush was becoming a candidate and we were all starting to pay some serious attention to him, discovering that he had taken a $300,000 investment, and I think it was borrowed money. Yeah. In fact, it might have been Bin Laden borrowed money. Osama bin Laden funded one of his oil companies, and then basically, into the Dallas Rangers, and then it's the Rangers, right?
Yeah, the Texas Rangers.
The Texas Rangers. And basically blackmailed the town and got over $100 million, $170 million, something like that.
$190 million to fund to actually take state. It's so funny because you think about Texas and how proud conservatives are of Texas being its own country, and we don't let the government tell us what to do. Well, they let the government tell them what to do when it comes to executing people, obviously, and they let the government seize land under eminent domain for the purposes of building the ballpark in Texas, this publicly funded stadium. And George W. Bush cashed out that $300,000 loan to the tune of $15 million when he sold his interest in the franchise finally. To another friend of his father, by the way, a Texas billionaire by the name of Tom Hicks.
So, he has this 4,000 or 5,000% increase in revenue as a result of basically socialism.
Yeah.
And is that
socialism for the rich?
Right, for the rich. Is that characteristic? In fact, it's not even really socialism. It's crony capitalism of the very worst kind. Is that characteristic of what's going on with all these other big players? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Oh, definitely. But I'd like to give another example, too, because I think it really shows how nefarious this kind of stuff can be. Phil Anschutz He's one of the richest people in the United States. He's only done 3 interviews in the last 30 years. And according to his spokesperson, Phil believes that's 3 interviews too many. Wouldn't talk to me for my book. Phil Anschutz is the minority owner of every pro sports team in the Los Angeles area. He has taken in hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies over his lifetime. Phil Anschutz is also the owner of the Weekly Standard and the Examiner newspapers. Both the Weekly Standard and the Examiner, which is a right-leaning paper with a far-right editorial page, they both operate at a loss.
Really?
They lose money.
The Weekly Standard constantly has their people on national television simply because they're the Weekly Standard.
Exactly, exactly. But they're subsidized by us through Phil Anschutz. So, frankly, for all their talk about the market and the magical hand of the market, if the market really did its work, there wouldn't be a Weekly Standard and there wouldn't be an Examiner newspaper. We're underwriting this through our tax dollars, not even through buying tickets. That's what's also very nefarious about this. It's not the owning the team. It's not the $10 beer that makes the profits. That's pocket change.
It's not the wise selection of coaches and players.
Oh, no. It's real estate. And it's owning land and having public land given to you for the purposes of having a stadium to it. Yes, exactly.
And then pay for the construction.
And we can thank Sandra Day O'Connor for that, because when the eminent domain law was written, she wrote the decision. And in the decision, they talked about how the government could seize land if it's for a public use, and she lists like 3 things, and the last thing she says is, or a sports stadium is the last thing and that has been the very slender legal reasoning. Like I believe the 3 things she lists are like a hospital, a school, or a sports stadium. And so it's that
essential public functions.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And who knows how conscious she was of what she was unleashing, but she really did unleash something. I'd love to give another example if we have time. Can I?
Yeah, go for it.
Because this is the one that says so much. Dick DeVos, multi-billionaire, owner of the Orlando Magic, has taken $1.5 billion in state subsidies from the state of Florida to build the new arena for the Orlando Magic.
This is the family that basically owns Republican politics in Michigan, where I was born and grew up.
Okay, so you know him well.
And what's his name from Blackwater?
There you go.
Their nephew, as I recall.
Well, that's the thing. Dick DeVos's son, Dick Jr., married Betsy Prince, the daughter of Edgar Prince, who's a longtime friend of Dick DeVos. They were actually co-heads of the local Bircher Society up there in Michigan for a while.
Amway fortune.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And look at Eric Prince, though. Eric Prince, the head of Blackwater, the former head of Blackwater, got over $700 million in government contracts throughout the Bush administration, while Dick DeVos is one of the largest givers to the Republican Party during that time. In fact, he's responsible for the largest single donation to the RNC in its history. So it's like you see how these things work, and we're underwriting this dirty kind of lobbying and the kind of privatized fraternity army that Blackwater represents with all its murderous intentions, and sports becomes the prime economic engine for that process.
And in the last 30 seconds, I thought one of the most amazing things in your article was the hyper-militarization now of sports.
Oh, yeah.
Just riff on that for just a second.
No, absolutely. I mean, David Petraeus throwing the first coin at games, the way in which you saw that the recent 10-year anniversary of 9/11 was really given over not to the president but to the NFL to celebrate throughout the day, and that was the public space. And it really was a celebration of war more than it was the kind of somber remembrance that me as a New Yorker would have been much more comfortable with, quite frankly. And as I said, I thought the best thing the NFL ever did was after 9/11, they canceled the games that next week. They opted for understatement. 10 years later, the opposite.
Yeah. Dave, thanks so much for illuminating us.
My privilege.
Much appreciated. We need more sports teams in America run like the Packers, actually, a community-owned station. Love them or hate them, they're owned by the people, not a right-wing billionaire. And they just won the Super Bowl. I don't think that's a coincidence. Today we learned that our democracy could be hacked by an 8th grader with 26 bucks. That's what a security assessment team with the U.S. Department of Energy discovered when they successfully hacked into a Diebold electronic voting machine and were able to change voting results without leaving any trace behind. Here's how they did it.
Inserting alien electronics into the electronic voting machine in a classic man-in-the-middle attack allows would-be vote tamperers to control the touchscreen, but also the information being sent to the voting machine's computer. The cost of parts for this attack is $10 to $26 in retail quantities, much cheaper in volume. This attack does not require understanding what the computer or microprocessor in the voting machine is doing. This attack highlights the importance of checking.
These, the folks who cracked this machine, by the way, are the same guys that make sure the facilities that manufacture our nuclear weapons are secure. This is a government agency that did this. And the security assessment team leaders said about their ability to hack this voting machine, this is a national security issue. Despite all this, in next year's election, 30% of voters are expected to use these very same hack-easy voting machines that the rest of the world have shelved, citing security concerns. And today, with the rise of hacktivist groups like Anonymous, this gaping hole in the security of our elections could be exploited for absurd purposes. We've already seen what Anonymous is capable of, from taking down government websites in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Bahrain, to hacking into emails belonging to the security firm H.B. Gary Federal, to taking on the Bank of America, to organizing mass protests against San Francisco's transportation system, to most recently uncovering the identity of a New York City cop who maced women on Wall Street and posting his name, address, and family members on the web. I mean, the list really goes on and on. So imagine if they and other hackers coordinated together to hack into voting machines nationwide and skew the voting results of, say, the Republican Party coming up, the Republican Party primaries coming up in a couple of months. Suddenly, libertarian hero Ron Paul might be the guy to take on President Obama. Can you see the Republican leaders' heads exploding? Or maybe the hackers just want to be mischievous, and suddenly these deep-old voting machines record millions of write-in votes for Lady Gaga. And Republicans then have to rally around Gaga's platform of gay rights. Imagine that. I know it sounds like a joke, but it's serious. If our voting machines are so vulnerable that an 8th grader with basic Radio Shack tools can hack into them, think about what a collective of people around the world who devote their lives to hacking computers and aren't too pleased with our government right now could do. Maybe they'll just wait until the next general election to hack the vote. Can you imagine what would happen if on Election Day next year, when the votes are counted, we discover that Scooby-Doo was just elected president? Yeah, we'd be just as surprised, too. Can you see the headlines around the world? Scooby-Doo wins in a landslide. Americans elect a cartoon dog. Frankly, given the Republican field right now, that might be an improvement. And would at least be a dog's revenge for Mitt Romney tying his dog to the roof of his car and driving hundreds of miles.
Former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney was in Pittsburgh today for a fundraising visit. He answered some questions about a Boston Globe report that during a family vacation some 24 years ago, he strapped his dog's cage with the dog inside it to the top of his car during a 12-hour road trip.
You know, PETA has not been my fan over the years, and they're not happy that my dog likes fresh air.
The serious point here is that if we, the people, created a government to protect and administer the commons, if we own the government as part of that commons, then the most important part of that commons, of the government, is the vote. It's the to quote Thomas Paine, it's the beating heart of democracy. So privatizing that vote, handing it over to companies that handle our votes in secret and are not transparent and not accountable to us, is a serious crime against democracy itself. Then again, maybe a Scooby-Doo presidency would finally lead to the long overdue legalization of marijuana. Whoa. After the break, author and evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins joins me for a special edition of Conversations with Great Minds.
What drives the world?
The fear-mongering used by politicians.
Who makes decisions?
Considerable breakthrough has already been made.
Who can you trust?
No one who is imbued with a global missionary zeal.
Where are we heading?
State-controlled capitalism is called fascism.
When nobody dares to ask, we do. RT, question more.
tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm very pleased to be joined by British ethologist and evolutionary biologist Professor Richard Dawkins. He's a scientist and author whose life work has educated millions and challenged the popular beliefs of a generation. Professor Dawkins is best known for the ideas laid out in his landmark book, The Selfish Gene, and developed further in The Extended Phenotype, which is the radical notion that Darwinian selection happens not at the level of the individual, but at the level of our DNA, and implies that humans evolved for only one purpose, to serve our genes. He's also equally well known for his criticism of creationism and intelligent design. He's an atheist and humanist, and a vice president of the British Humanist Association, and supporter of the Brights movement. Professor Dawkins has become a leading figure of new atheism. The English language version of his groundbreaking book, The God Delusion, where he argues that a supernatural creator almost certainly does not exist, and that religious faith is a delusion, has sold more than 2 million copies and been translated into more than 30 languages. He is an emeritus fellow at the University of Oxford and founder of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. He joins me now from our studios in Miami. Professor Dawkins, welcome.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. In The Selfish Gene, you shook up the discussion of natural selection. You coined the term the selfish gene as a way, correct me if I have this wrong, please, as a way of expressing the gene-centered view of evolution as opposed to the views focused on group selection. Given that you also say that genes just are, that they can't survive independently of the cell can't survive independently of the organism, how do you reconcile the need for biological cooperation with your hypothesis of a selfish gene?
Cooperation takes place at the level of the individual. Individuals cooperate. Genes are selfish. The whole point about my book, The Selfish Gene, is not that individuals are selfish, but individuals may very well be altruistic and cooperative as a result of their genes being selfish. And obviously that takes a book to explain, but it does not mean that individuals are selfish, still less that they should be selfish.
Point taken, and a good point. I'm curious about the genes being selfish, the individual genes themselves. You said it would take a book to explain. We have actually 20 some odd minutes here to talk. Can you explain your reasoning on this?
Yeah, well, obviously genes, they're only made of DNA, so they can't actually be selfish in the same sense as we are. They don't actually have motives, they're not conscious, they don't think. But a gene that causes individuals to behave in such a way as to foster the welfare of that gene will survive. And so it's the self-interest of the gene in that sort of metaphorical sense that I mean. What you will not get is natural selection favoring a gene that sacrifices itself for the benefit of other genes. But you may very well get an individual that sacrifices itself for the benefit of other individuals.
Wouldn't that willingness to sacrifice yourself for other individuals be gene-driven behavior?
Yes, it would. And that's the point, that a gene that makes an individual sacrifice itself, the individual self, for the benefit of the gene will survive. And that would often mean for the benefit of copies of the gene in other individuals, notably close relatives.
Right. So, in other words, our altruistic impulses, the desire not to be selfish, but to care for family, for friends, for community, and to sacrifice for them, actually perpetuates our genes, even if we don't produce offspring, because those genes are also appearing in others of our local family.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Genes aren't static. They'll express various alleles in response to the environment around them. The spontaneous development of celiac disease in response to food poisoning, for example, is, I think, a pretty good example. So how does that entire concept of an interactive phenotype fit into your theory?
What you're talking about there is the expression of genes, so that the genes that are in you may or may not express themselves, and whether they express themselves may depend upon the environment, may depend upon your food, may depend upon your age, and so on. So the genes themselves are just in you, and they may or may not get passed on to your offspring, but how they express themselves will depend very much on the environment, notably by the other genes that happen to share the body with them.
And not just in an individual organ or cell or close area, but more broadly.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And also it would be their interaction with other genetic material. For example, my understanding is that more than half of the total DNA in our body is not human genes. It's all the viruses and bacteria and fungi and other things.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's very interesting. And yes, interaction with the bacteria, for example, in our gut, which are massively numerous in our gut, and even within every one of our cells, the mitochondria, which are these vital little organelles that are responsible for giving us energy, they were once upon a time bacteria. And they reproduce by the same means as bacteria do reproduce, as an entirely independent population inside our cells, and they get passed on in the egg to the next generation.
Yeah, so at some point in the past, cells were infected by bacteria, and thus began the evolutionary process that led to mitochondria in cells.
In the very remote past, yes.
Yeah, I'm curious if in your work you've come across anything that might indicate that phages are the super small, for our viewers, the super small viruses that infect only bacteria rather than an entire. If they have played a role in modifying the genes of bacteria that we then interact with and that may in fact modify our genes. Is there any evidence of that?
Very probably. Yes, very, very probably. Bacteria are rather different from us in that bacteria are constantly swapping genetic material, rather like we with our computers copy and paste bits of text from one document into another. Bacteria are constantly swapping, exchanging, copying and pasting genetic material into other bacteria. And viruses, phages, play a role in that, yes.
Yeah. I've had, over the years, a number of political discussions, which is typically the topic of my programs, other than this segment, and had objectivists in particular, people who are followers of Ayn Rand, actually quote you and suggest that your selfish gene metaphor and the economics of Milton Friedman or Friedrich von Hayek and the modern libertarian movement are the same thing, and that your selfish gene movement or your selfish gene hypothesis, assertion, you'll have to fill in the word. I'm sorry, I don't have the correct word. Informs that, not informs that movement, but demonstrates the validity of individual selfishness. I'm curious how you would respond to those people. I'm sure you've heard
I would disavow and disown that. One of the most surprising things that happened after The Selfish Gene was published was that I started getting letters from right-wing libertarians in America. I'd never even met a right-wing libertarian, but they started writing to me. It's a total misunderstanding. As I said before, genes are selfish, and that's nothing to do with whether individuals are selfish, or rather it's a very complicated relationship. And in particular, it says nothing whatever about the moral rightness or wrongness of being selfish. You can take a stand on that, which is based upon something quite different from my stand on evolutionary biology. There's no reason why somebody shouldn't read The Selfish Gene and, as it happens, be a right-wing libertarian, but absolutely there's no reason why they should read The Selfish Gene and therefore become a right-wing libertarian. I have always voted on the left in British elections.
That's interesting. I'm curious your thoughts on the relationship between genetics and political worldview. There's been a fair amount of speculation and writing in recent months about the genetics, or at least the neurobiology, of politics, of political worldview. How do you think that whole dance plays out at the level of genes?
Well, I mean, one's political opinions, like everything else about one's views about everything, are governed by one's brain. And brains are, of course, built by genes interacting with each other and with the environment in the processes of embryology. So there are doubtless genetically influenced differences in brains which affect political opinions, but it's going to be very complicated. And I would hesitate to say anything in detail about that.
Yeah, just so it would be more like there's no gene for race, there are just genes for all these various characteristics. There is no gene for being a conservative or a liberal. There are genes that might give people certain proclivities that would cause them to draw toward one or the other?
That's right. Yes, in very complicated interaction with other genes and with upbringing, education, and so on.
Right. You write and talk a lot, and I apologize, I've only read 2 of your books, but I've read pieces of many others and a lot of commentary over the years. You write and talk a lot about the classical concept of gradual Darwinian evolution. I'm curious, and my apologies if you've already dealt with this in one of your books and I just missed it, about your thoughts on Stephen Jay Gould's concept of punctuated equilibrium as an enhancement to Darwin, the concept that evolution really, macroevolution, species evolution, is not generally this slow, gradual process, but rather there are periodic disasters that happen that wipe out 90+% of an individual group, and the small subset of that group that is most adapted to the new environment, even though they may have been maladapted to the earlier environment, are the ones that continue to survive. And maybe even that accounts for gaps in the fossil record. I'm curious your thoughts on that whole thing.
Well, what you've just outlined is not really punctuated equilibrium, although you could be forgiven for thinking that, because punctuated equilibrium was expressed in such a confused way that anybody would be forgiven for muddling up at least 3 different things. What you just described is the phenomenon of mass extinction, which is indeed very important. I mean, every 20 or 30 million years or so, you may get a mass extinction, and then occasionally you get a very, very large mass extinction. And after that, in a sense, evolution kind of starts all over again. So when the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, the mammals, which up to then had been rather small bit players in the drama, suddenly flourished because the dinosaurs had gone, and gave rise to all the great diversity of mammals that we see today. Now, that pattern of periodic mass extinctions followed by a new flowering of evolutionary diversity, that is undoubtedly true. That happens. That is not punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium is the idea that there are, if you follow the evolution of any one lineage through the fossil record, you may see long periods of stasis when nothing very much happens. They stay pretty much the way they are. And then suddenly there's a jump to a rather different form. Mm-hmm. Now, even that is confused. It's confusing because it muddles up 2 different things. It muddles up one idea, which is that there really is a sudden leap in evolution, a macro mutation. A child is born of a different species from its parents. That's one possible interpretation, which I think is wrong. The other possible interpretation is that evolution has been going on, but very rapidly, during the time when, as it were, paleontologists aren't looking, during the time when fossils are not being laid down. Perhaps the fossils are being laid down in a different geographical area. So if you dig in any one place, you don't see the change. What you see is what looks like a sudden change, because animals that have been evolving in a different area suddenly re-migrate into the area where you're digging. So that looks like a sudden jump. Now, that's perfectly plausible. That probably happens. That probably does account for some of the apparent gaps in the fossil record. But I do deprecate the use of the phrase punctuated equilibrium, because from the very start, from Eldridge and Gould's initial introduction of it, it has been confused, not least by Eldridge and Gould themselves.
Oh, Very interesting. Yeah, it's been 20 years or more since I read Gould, so thank you for correcting me on this. We will get back. I'd like to get back to, or not back to. I'd like to get to a conversation of religion and spirituality and some of the other issues that you tackled in some of your other books in just a moment. First, we have to take a break for a second. More conversations with great minds with Richard Dawkins when we come back in just a moment.
What drives the world?
The fear-mongering used by politicians.
Who makes decisions?
Considerable breakthrough has already been made.
Who can you trust?
No one who is imbued with a global missionary zeal.
Where are we heading?
State-controlled capitalism is called fascism.
When nobody dares to ask, we do. RT, question more.
Welcome back to Conversations with the Great Minds. Tonight I'm speaking with evolutionary scientist Richard Dawkins, whose work has made him a leading figure in new atheism. Professor Dawkins' new book, The Magic of Reality, How We Know What's Really True, will be released in the United States on October 4th. And Professor Dawkins, welcome back. Your new book, The Magic of Reality, How We Know What's Really True, and some of your other works on the God delusion, for example. You were Well, actually, let me go to The Magic of Reality first. This is just a beautifully illustrated book and makes science so accessible to basically people of any age. You asked the first question of the first chapter, what is reality? What is magic? Is almost an existential question. You want to take a whack at that?
Well, this is a book designed for young people primarily, but actually for all ages. And I'm trying to make the point that magic, as in the sense of supernatural magic, magic spells, as in fairy tales and miracles and Harry Potter and things, that reality, real science, where there aren't any miracles, is much more exciting and much more magical in the good sense of the sort of poetic magic, when we say it's magical looking up at the Milky Way at night, that kind of thing. So I'm trying to show that myths can be fun, and there are plenty of myths in the book, but science is better. Science is more interesting, more fascinating, more enthralling, and that takes reality seriously. We don't have miracles, we don't have supernatural spells, we don't have magic in that sense. What we have is reality, which is magical, is wonderful, and we study it by the methods of science.
And speaking of reality and magic, and I would put probably most religions in the category of magic, or perhaps you do. In the UK, you have religious fundamentalists, but they're largely politically marginalized. Here in the United States, basically the religious fundamentalists have become a portal through which candidates for the presidency must pass, particularly on the Republican side. Do you think this may have something to do with your country having had the experience of religious zealots like Cromwell and Guy Fawkes, whereas we here where they've never created a full-out theocracy?
It's very difficult to know. It's a curious anomaly, because if you look worldwide, religion is pretty much a third world problem. Religion goes with lack of education, goes with poverty, it goes with despair. And I mean, that's why in Western Europe religion is dying, all except for the Muslims, but in Christendom, in Western Europe, Christendom, religion is dying because of prosperity and everything that one would think that America has, and indeed does have. And yet half of America, very nearly half, is not only religious, but preposterously so. I mean, 40% of the American electorate actually believe that the world is only 6,000 years old, or less than 10,000 years old, which is a quite ludicrous error. It's not a slight error, it's a massive error. And this is something which stands out like a sore thumb. I mean, you expect to find that in Islamic countries, and you do. You expect to find that in Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on. You do not expect to find it in the richest and most highly educated country in the world. But I think you possibly can get a clue to it by noticing that those parts of the United States which are most influenced by this kind of fundamentalism tend to be those parts that are less well educated, that are less prosperous, less looked after, and so there might be a tendency for people who have who don't have a very nice life for one reason or another to turn to religion as a kind of refuge. And that's one theory that I've heard advanced. There are others. I mean, another theory is that because the United States has a constitution in which church and state is very rigidly separated, unlike in Western Europe, where many countries, including Britain, have an established church. And because we have an established church, it's been argued, religion has become sort of boring. A church is a place you go to be married and to be buried, but otherwise you don't go to church. But in America, where there is a constitutional separation between church and state, perhaps this has freed up religion to become free enterprise and to use all the sort of tricks of capitalism, of advertising and so on. And that may be why it's taken such a hold of the less educated classes in America.
And not only that, we give them complete tax breaks. So you end up with
tax breaks are just shocking. I mean, yeah. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, so you end up with people like Pat Robertson, who's a billionaire with a B as a result of this. I'm curious if our genes are controlling our behavior, and many people have had experiences that they would describe as deeply spiritual, and thus maybe draw them to religion. Why would such a gene echo down through the generations?
Well, it's a difficult thing to say that genes control us. We are very much influenced by our education, by our environment. So I'm not sure that I would want to ask that in a sort of genetic way. It's probably true, as we said earlier on in our conversation. I mean, genes do influence brains, and brains are what decide whether you're going to be religious or not. And so there might be a genetic component in whether you are, in whether you tend to be drawn to religion. Now, you mentioned the word spiritual, and that's a much misused word, because people often use spiritual to mean the kind of thing that I mean by the magic of reality, the kind of thing I mean by looking up at the stars and being filled with wonder, being filled with joy at seeing the stupendous sight of the universe, or looking down a microscope, or thinking, or going to the Grand Canyon and looking down through the layers of geological time. I mean, that's magical in the sense of the magic of reality, and you could even call that spiritual. But I rather resent the hijacking of that. Call it spiritual if you like, I prefer not to. I rather resent the hijacking of that feeling, which I feel, and which any of my scientist friends feel, hijacking by religion. It is not a monopoly of religion. We all feel it, or we all are capable of feeling it.
This is the human condition. I very well said. In the God delusion, you're asserting that a supernatural creator doesn't exist, and that belief in a personal God qualifies as a delusion. Do you also make that argument for the belief in any sort of consciousness beyond the individual? For example, could it be that the universe itself is a conscious organism and we're one expression of it within it? Or for that matter, what is consciousness?
Well, I don't know what consciousness is, and it's a very difficult philosophical question. I don't think it's probably going to be helpful to talk about the universe as a whole being conscious. I know that some rather mystical philosophers have suggested something like that. I think that whatever consciousness is, it's manifested by brains. It's something to do with brains, or the functional equivalent of brains. I mean, I wouldn't rule out that one day somebody might build an electronic computer which was programmed in such a way that it was conscious. That seems to me to be actually quite likely. But it comes from very, very complex organization, such as the brain, which is an extremely complicated organization of billions of neurons. And if anybody makes a computer that's conscious, that again will be extremely complicated with many, many, many units, electronic units. So no, I don't think it's helpful to think that consciousness resides in the universe as a whole. I think consciousness is something that emerges by the evolutionary process in the universe, wherever in the universe brains or something functionally equivalent to brains evolve.
Do you think it's conceivable that as the internet and the number of computers connected to it begins to approach numbers that are similar to the number of axons and ganglions and synapses in the brain, that the internet itself may, you said consciousness emerges from it, that consciousness may emerge from the internet?
That is a fascinating science fiction speculation, and before we laugh it away, we should remember that that's pretty much what did happen in the evolution of brains, because brains started off as very simple nervous systems, and then the simple nervous systems got bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more interconnected in complicated ways, and that is what's happening to the internet. And so I wouldn't absolutely rule out the possibility that sometime in the future something like the internet, probably very different from the way the internet is now, but something like the internet, a global network of electronic connections between computing devices all over the world, might develop something like the same properties as the brain evolved millions of years ago.
It would be quite remarkable to one day turn your computer on and have it say, "Well, hello there, Professor. How was your tea this morning?"
I'm sure that's already possible. I'm sure that's already possible.
But I mean, with intent,
it would be a bit of a trick. It would be a bit of a fake.
But with worldwide intent. Back to your book, the Magic of Reality. We have just 2 minutes left here, and I want to be sure to. You ask a number of great questions in here. Who was the first person, for example?
Well, yes. I mean, that's chapter 2 of the book. Every chapter in the book is a question like that. Yes. And every chapter begins with myths and then goes into the science. So who really was the first person? Well, there never really was a first person, because every animal ever born was of the same species as its parents. And so there never was a first Homo sapiens born to a Homo erectus parent. It all happened gradually. But if you stick together enough generations going back into the past, then you'll find a gradual turning into apes and monkeys and shrews and going back to fish and beyond. So we are descended from fish. But every single creature that was ever born is of the same species, was of the same species as its parents. The process is so gradual, rather like the movement of the hour hand of your watch. You can't see it move, but if you wait long enough, you see that it has moved.
Professor, it's extraordinary. We have just only 30 seconds left. The main message that you would want our viewers to know about your work.
I'm passionate about the truth, and the truth can be ascertained by science, by evidence. Never believe anything until you've seen the evidence.
That's brilliant. Professor Richard Dawkins, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
To watch this conversation again, as well as other Conversations with Great Minds, go to our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com. That's the big picture for tonight. For more information on the stories we covered, visit our websites at tomhartman.com, freespeech.org, and RT.com. Also, check out our 2 YouTube channels. There are links at tomhartman.com. The entire show is also available as a free video podcast on iTunes, and we have a free Tom Hartman iPhone and iPad app at the App Store. You can send us feedback at Twitter at Tom_Hartman, on Facebook at Tom_Hartman, our blogs, message boards, and telephone comment lines at tomhartman.com. And don't forget, democracy begins with you. Get out there and get active. Tag. You're it. We'll see you tomorrow.